Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. On today's episode, Professor Erin Thompson, Department of Art and Music at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, discusses her book, Smashing Statues: The Rise and Fall of America's Public Monuments. Professor Thompson explains the role of Confederate monuments, what they symbolize, and to whom their message is aimed. As we question their continued presence in public spaces, the stories of these monuments remain largely unknown. We spoke on March 28, 2023.
Hi, my name is Erin Thompson. I'm a professor at the City University of New York, and in 2023, I published a book called Smashing Statues: The Rise and Fall of American Monuments.
Yes, and we'll be talking about that book today, so thank you so much for it. I learned a tremendous amount. Maybe you could begin by telling us how you came to write the book and what you discovered in writing it.
So I had some cocktails and then I opened Twitter in the summer of 2020, which is not a good idea. Don't drink and tweet, my friends. And I saw a video of someone throwing a rope around the neck of a statue of Columbus in the Twin Cities. And I tweeted something about this in a more lighthearted manner than I would have done if I hadn't had some cocktails, and this went viral. The tweet basically was surprised people because I said that I was someone who studies the deliberate destruction of cultural property, which I do. That's my field. But that they then thought, wait, why is she cheering on this particular takedown? Shouldn't she, like every other arts professional, want to save every single scrap of art for the rest of eternity? So I was interested in how much attention this issue was getting in the US in general, but I was also struck by the questions that people were asking in the replies. There are thousands of replies to this, and people were asking things like, what's so wrong with Columbus? Or isn't it un-American to take down statues? Or not civilized? And I'm a classicist by training, ancient Greek and Roman, ancient Near Eastern. Every official statue that was put up in antiquity that I study has been torn down at least once and thrown away. So I'm not so surprised by the revolution of monuments. And I thought, okay, I might have something that I can tell people. And then I also started wondering things that weren't in the news stories, like what exactly happens to all these statues. All the news stories ended with they're loaded into a truck and driven away. And I was like, where's the truck going?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And one of the things that I appreciated about the book is you really go into detail about how these monuments were created and structured and developed and funded, which I found incredibly unsurprising, I guess, once I realized who was behind them. But maybe you could start by giving us an idea. In the book, you make a differentiation between a memorial monument or a memorial structure and a monument structure. So maybe you could kind of tell us the difference between that.
Yeah, and plenty of people make that distinction in different ways. And certainly there are many installations that are mixed, but I, in the book, went with the definition that a memorial is something that mourns the past. It's about something we never want to have happen again, as a reminder of what we don't want to have happen. And a monument is supposed to be inspiration for the future. So it's about encouraging people to act like the people honored in this monument. So to me, monuments aren't really about the past. They're about the future. They're what we want to take from the past and continue into the future.
Yeah, it's a good definition to have as we go forward, because I think when we talk about some of the statues that are in question, some of the monuments in question, they're for the most part problematic, but they're problematic for specific reasons. So we'll get into Lincoln in a minute, but can you talk about some of the Confederate monuments that went up and how they got there right after the war.
Yeah, so to back up a little, what I really wanted to do as a historian for this book was think about why monuments went up and what are they continuing to do in the present. So I saw a lot of the debate about monuments being a debate about the character of the person represented in the monument. When to me, I could kind of care less. You know, it's if someone was terrible, but the monument is encouraging people to act in a good way, well, that's a very different question. So what I investigated was the circumstances of how we got the monuments that we got. And obviously I can't cover each of the tens of thousands of public monuments in America, but I tried to select some representative ones, including Confederate monuments. I should also say it's not like I think all Northern Civil War monuments get off the problematic hook, but I focused on Confederate ones to ask why did they go up? And it often was decades or 100+ years after the end of the Civil War. And the more you look, the more you realize, oh, they had very, very little to do with celebrating the war or mourning the dead. They're much more about telling people in communities their place in a present racial order. So, for example, one of the chapters is about the Confederate monument in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the first monument after the murder of George Floyd to be removed officially. The mayor of Birmingham ordered it taken down. And it went up in a city that wasn't even founded until after the close of the Civil War. So it had so little to do. It's to the dead of the Civil War, but no citizens of Birmingham died in the Civil War. The city didn't exist then. What it did have to do with, and you can see very clearly, because that monument went up in two chunks, the base and the obelisk on top of it. Both of those chunks went up during interracial or unionization efforts among area miners. And in the dedication speeches, it's very clear that the men who paid for the monument chunks were the mine owners, the politicians, etc. And they are lecturing the audience of white Birminghamians, white Alabamians, to say, you need to respect the legacy of your Confederate ancestors. They died to essentially avoid, not even, I'm not summarizing here, a quote that came out of the mouth of one of these dedicators was that the Confederate veterans died to defend against the, quote, hideous specter of racial equity. And I think once you will look into that history and understand this is not a monument about the Civil War, this is a monument about keeping poor people poor, then I think our attitude as communities should change towards these monuments once we understand what they were put in for.
Yeah, I had written that down to ask you about that exact quote. And I think that ties nicely into kind of the some of the figures you quote in the book, like 90 Confederate statues went up in the first 20 years after the war. And a lot of these were those columns with a soldier on the top. And maybe you could talk about how that pose specifically, which I think you called parade rest, functioned as a way to kind of do the same thing you were just talking about, which is, keep Black people in their place and the racial order in place, but also remind white people of their place in it as well. So maybe you could unpack a little bit.
Yeah, so fortunately, a lot of the questions of how many went up and when and where had been covered by a historian, Gaines and Foster, in a book called Ghosts of the Civil War, or Ghosts of the Confederacy, sorry, which I really recommend. It's a real page turner of a history. But one thing that Foster didn't cover was why this format. You might think Confederate monument and think, Lee charging around on a horse, but actually by far the most common form is just an anonymous low-ranked soldier standing there. And I'm an art historian. I like to think about why we choose forms, and it was just confusing for a while. Like, why not somebody charging into battle or wounded or returning home or just anything that would suggest military service more than just standing there. And then I looked into military manuals from the period to try and figure out, all right, when would they have stood like this? And it turns out it wasn't during battle at all. This was a pose known as parade rest that new recruits would take during training while being yelled at by a drill instructor, essentially, both in the North and the South. And you were forbidden to move or even speak when you were in this pose. Then I'm reading these dedication speeches, which are printed in the newspapers, often in full. And it's really not a secret of why these monuments went up. And they are praising the obedience of the Confederate soldier. There's one factory owner, Carborough is named after him, who says that the glory of the Confederate soldier is he was a cog in a wheel. And it's very clear to me that what the dedicators of these monuments wanted was again to shape people to be more obedient, saying your ancestors were at their best when they were listening to their betters, when they were following orders, when they weren't questioning anything. So go forth and do that too, people who are working, people who might want to ask for a better wage.
Yeah, and that was incredibly insightful, I thought, because it really ties it to the idea you introduced about the purpose of a monument, which is kind of not creating a hero, but this person's a hero of, your role in society, not you're heroic because you're supporting white supremacy in this case. I mean, quite literally.
Well, and something I say in the book is, unless you are wealthy enough and politically powerful enough to pay for a monument and put it up where you want to, the monument is to tell you what your role in society is. And unsurprisingly, it's not often to your interest.
That's right. And now I think we can get into, that leads us correctly into a Borglum, I think is his name, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and the creation of Stone Mountain, and just the drama, I guess, that went into that, not only behind the scenes, but then going forward. So you could tell us that story and how Stone Mountain came to be.
Oh man, so do you have like 5 hours in this podcast? It's so hard to summarize the story of Stone Mountain, which is the world's largest Confederate monument, a project begun in 1914. And the first sculptor was a man named Gutzon Borglum, who was an immigrant, who was so obsessed with Lincoln that he named his son Lincoln. He lived in Connecticut, but he becomes the sculptor of this Confederate glory, and goes so deep into it that he very quickly joins the Ku Klux Klan, which was refounded in 1914 on this very mountain, well, quote unquote mountain. It's like a granite outcropping outside of Atlanta. And he gets fired eventually and goes on to sculpt Mount Rushmore. And I still can't believe that this part of the story is not known. So he sort of defects from north to south and then goes back north again. And he's really remembered today as this sculptor of great national glory. There's a lot, Mount Rushmore is very controversial these days as being on sacred lands, unceded lands, but hardly anyone mentions it. Also, it's sculpted by this total anti-Semite Klansman. And I got really a deep dig into his finances, because so there was a Confederate widow who had put up a lot of Confederate monuments in Georgia, and this was her final big vision. She was getting towards the end of her life, and she thought, I want to make some huge memorial on the side of this granite mountain. There's a very dramatic, like 10-story cliff face that she was envisioning being carved, but she just had this idea that it should be a bust of General Lee. So she contacts Borglum, who shows up. He is in a huge amount of debt, and he's like, great, but you're thinking too small. There should actually be, I think he proposes something like more than 300 figures carved on this mountain. And why? Because he negotiates a contract where he gets paid a percentage of the final price. So the more it costs, the more the Confederacy is glorified, the more he gets. And I just kept like reading these, documents about his finances and almost like looking around me like, does anybody else see this? He's just in it for the money, and he's in the Klan for the money as well. So when it starts up again in the 19 teens, the Klan is like a pyramid scheme whose only products are racism, because everybody would get a percentage of the downstream initiation fees and dues of the members. And so, of course, they wanted to have a great big monument to a sort of advertising campaign for this. So, and Stone Mountain becomes nowadays one of these like, oh, well, we can't remove that, it's historic monument, blah, 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 blah. The thing is, because of all of this embezzlement scandal about Borglum and the Klan, he's not just content with getting his already large chunk of money that he's promised in the contract. He's also trying to skim off money. Work is stopped and doesn't resume until the 1960s. And what we see today in what is, by the way, still Georgia's most visited tourist attraction, Stone Mountain Park, wasn't finished until 1972. So I sometimes joke, my grandparents have shag carpeting that's older than Stone Mountain, and that's not a historic protected monument. So maybe this one we could, just give it a rest.
Well, and what they ended up getting was very small kind of base of just 4 figures, right? It's Lee, Jackson, and Jefferson. Is that?
Yes. Yeah. It's just the 3. They're not even riding full-length horses. The horses kind of like off into the the fog.
Right. You almost like, when I saw a picture of it from far away, they kind of obscure it, so you almost don't see the monument, and that's probably on purpose.
Well, yeah, that's because they have to clean the monument every 5 years or so. Runoff from the mountaintop stains the face of the monument. My favorite fact that I learned after I finished the book is that there are rain pools on top of Stone Mountain that host a rare species of shrimp. So the runoff that is concealing this monument further and further from view is partially composed of shrimp poop. So the Confederate legacy versus shrimp poop, what will we do? But the association that now runs the park has said that they would have to pay something like $500,000 to clean the monument off. And there's a real question of whether they're going to bother to do that, or it might just sort of fade into the same color stone and be very difficult to make out.
Well, one of the things that you said in the book, and it kind of hit me when I was rereading some of my notes, was that, this Stone Mountain was used continuously to kind of rebirth the Klan, right? And they continuously hold, is it a yearly meeting there or something that happens?
They did from 1914 until 1958. And then if you go to the park, they'll be like, wow, the state of Georgia took our land and kicked out the Klan. State of Georgia took it over to serve as an anti-Brown v. Board, anti-school integration rallying point. So not such a gold star. I'm going to award them. And B, the rallies just moved a little bit farther down the slopes onto private land of Klan sympathizers. And they continued, I think, until the 90s. There's still like pro-Southern heritage, Sons of Confederate Veterans rallies that happen there. Often in ways that are very clearly tied to resisting anti-racist changes, et cetera, et cetera. So this is another thing that I think is important. You have to look at what a monument continues to encourage. So it's really not surprising that a monument built by Klansmen for use by Klansmen that has been welcoming to Klansmen for so long is continued to be used by white supremacists. And it's going to take a lot to disrupt that, a lot more than, say, attaching a little sign that says, by the way, here's some people have questioned the racial use of this monument or whatever.
Right. Yeah. It would take more than that. And then the efficacy of those disclaimers are sometimes called into question anyway. You mentioned in the book about Monticello and how, even though there are these push to include more of the slave narrative and presence, people still walk away thinking what they kind of thought before they walked in, right?
Yeah, it's very difficult to change people's minds because who likes to change their mind? It's cognitive dissonance is a type of physical pain. So if you visit a site thinking that Thomas Jefferson is a hero, you're not really going to want to take in a lot of information about how he was, a slave owner like any other slave owner. It's not real great. And I should say too that Monticello is one of the sites that's trying to do the most to not let you avoid this knowledge, but still has, I think, a long way to go.
Yeah, and but now getting back to white supremacy and the Klan, let's talk about Unite the Right and the General Lee monument that was in question there. So if you can kind of give us a history of that Virginia monument and how it travels through time to get to Unite the Right.
Yeah, and beyond. So the statue of Robert E. Lee, put up in 1924 in Charlottesville, Virginia, is still in the news. Next month, I'm going down to Charlottesville to attend the trial about its final disposition. So the very accelerated version of all that. The statue goes up in 1924 in the midst of a eugenics campaign to prohibit interracial marriage. That law is passed in the same year. They're frankly named Racial Integrity Act, and operates in Virginia until it's overturned by Loving v. Virginia, the Supreme Court case. So Lee, I think, goes up as a encouragement to white Virginians to maintain the racial lines, because Lee in the 30s, especially in the 20s and 30s, is a darling of the eugenicists. He's thought to be someone whose courage, whose strength was the product of wise mating. That's a quote from a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Lee in the 1930s. And by the way, Lee himself was obsessed with heredity, but not in the way that you would expect. He thought his father and his older brother had gone to the bad. Both of them had abandoned their families and evaded a lot of debt. So he thought he had to maintain a strict self-discipline at all times, or else the Lee blood would drag him down. Anyways, again, this idea that why a statue goes up has very little to do with the actual history of the person supposedly honored. So the statue's there in Charlottesville until in 2017, then 16-year-old high school student, Zaina Bryant, starts circulating a petition asking for it to be taken down or removed. The Charlottesville City Council takes up this idea. They establish a commission to advise them, hold public hearings. The commission recommends that it be moved to a slightly less prominent location. The statue, for example, is a couple blocks away from the courthouse. There are 3 Confederate monuments within the teeny tiny downtown area of Charlottesville. They're kind of like, you know what, that's enough of the lost cause. But this is basically turned into a publicity opportunity by far right, white supremacists, etc. There are a number of rallies. There are a lot of incidents during what becomes known as the Summer of Hate in Charlottesville in 2017, culminating in August 2017 with what is dubbed the Unite the Right rally, in the aftermath of which a white supremacist drives his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing one of them and injuring many others. Despite all of this, the statue remains in place because a group of locals had formed an organization to advocate for it being in place, and they had sued the city of Charlottesville saying, you don't have power to move this. That lawsuit drags on until 2021. There is a whole change in state law to make it clear that communities in Virginia can decide what they want to do with their own public monuments. The statue's taken down in late 2021, and then the city holds another series of public hearings about what they should do for it. So they finally invite bids. So tell us what who wants to take the statue and do what with it. All of the bids are, I want to put it in my Confederate Heritage Plantation House Museum, except for the one local group, the Jefferson School, which is an African American history organization, says we want to melt it down and give the bronze to an artist to create a new monument. The city awards it to them and are immediately sued by another group of these disappointed bidders, the Confederate Heritage folks, who say, no way, okay, the arguments are very silly. The new state law says that communities have the power to remove monuments, and the plaintiffs are saying, well, remove doesn't include melted down, or give it to somebody to melt down, which, I mean, only makes sense if you think that, for example, trash removal means that we take our trash and put it in a museum. No, removal is removal. They also asked the court, because they don't know, has it been melted down or not yet? So they asked the court that if it has been melted down, the court should force the city of Charlottesville to have the bronze cast into Civil War cannon that they can display. Not even, replica Civil War cannon, but just Civil War cannon. Like, it's a time traveling arts and crafts project. So I joke, but this shows how serious this can be, especially because if this melting down happens, it would be the very first irrevocable destruction of a Confederate monument, not just after 2020, but ever in the history of the US that I can find. These things have staying power. Everything that left its pedestal after 2020, I could only find one permanent destruction of a monument to, like, not even a whole monument, just a little portrait of Columbus on the side of another monument they chipped off. Everything else has been relocated or is in storage, awaiting decisions about its fate, which I sometimes joke is like American strategic racism reserve. Just in case we run out, we might have to redeploy these statues.
Right. And yeah, that's amazing. I think this would be a great time to kind of wrap it up around kind of what you're talking about with the spirit of the Confederacy monument, statue, or whatever it is that has been bought by, I think it's the Houston Museum of African American Culture, or has been placed there. I don't know if they purchased it, but maybe you could talk about that and some of the problems we have about recontextualizing or kind of, if we don't melt them down and we don't put them in a box in the, next to the Ark at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where do we put them, and what do we do with them? How do we fix this, I guess?
Yeah, so I think a big point I wanted to make with the book is that it's a lot harder to recontextualize a statue than you might think. So there's all this research showing we don't read the polite little signs. And then I wanted to also make the argument that just putting it in a museum is not enough to take away the harmful messages that it was designed to spread. Especially because think about, the last time you went to a museum, was there somebody telling you, here's how you think about this art? No, it's all about you get to have your own experience of an artwork, an unmediated meditation on the artwork. And sometimes those artworks are designed to make you think really hateful things. So we need some mediation. Plus, every time I talk to a curator about this, they're like, we don't want those statues. It's really expensive to move them around, to preserve them, to store them. We have enough stuff. We're not America's attic. Stop telling us to take statues. Anyway, so I talked to the head of the Houston Museum of African American Culture, which at that point, and I think still is the only specifically African American heritage organization to have rehomed a Confederate statue, so to speak. This statue came down from a park in Houston and was given by the mayor to them with the explicit understanding that they can do with it what they like. So it's not just that they're shining it up and maybe adding some signage. No, they are inviting guest artists to come and do what they want with it. They're considering selling off pieces of it to raise funds for the museum. They constructed a special area that's fenced off, so you can only see it if you want to under its context. And they're still worried. The CEO of the museum told me that he thinks it's too damn beautiful. because it's this like buff young dude with wings. He looks great. And he is there to make you think that the Confederacy and white supremacy is what you should want to like if you like the way he looks. But he is trying to use that emotional pull, that attraction, that sort of confusion of seeing the statue to engage people in debates about, for example, he thinks it's a great thing to have to explain to people the courage it took to stand up against racism in Texas in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, not just the big names, but everybody who was making a living in the face of this statue, which says to the citizens of Houston, I'm going to pull this sword out. The buff dude has a sword as well as wings. If you step out of line, and this is the whole atmosphere, the whole belief system, this is the baked in social structure in which you're living, and the idea that you could resist that is awe-inspiring.
Well, if you had to kind of sum up your findings or where you stand today after having done this work for the book, what would you kind of summarize your thinking about having done it?
I think that I'm most convinced that communities need to make public monuments actually public. They weren't put up in a democratic process. Often it's really difficult to have a democratic process to decide their fate, but I think that's what should happen, and that these discussions should involve looking into the history of the monument, and that sometimes I felt like I was cheating when I was writing this book, because it was so easy to look into the history. You get into these, digitized newspaper archives, and people are just putting it right out there what they think. There's no reading between the lines. They're like proud of their white supremacy. And yeah, I think we should all look into the history of monuments in our communities and think, is this really what we want our nation to continue to look like? Is this the role models we want here or not?
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.